What's going on, everyone? My name is Hunter, and welcome to the 5th episode of the SvelteKit and PocketBase series. In this video, we're finally going to be able to validate user inputs within our application, and we'll accomplish this using Zod. Now, I did already make a video covering form validation in SvelteKit using Zod, so please, if Zod is a foreign word to you, I would highly recommend going and watching that video first. I'll leave a card in the top right, as well as a link in the video description. Now, before we actually get started with validating our forms, there is something that I want to cover because the maintainer of PocketBase has actually opened a pull request on my live stream project here, mentioning the fact that we need to call auth refresh to ensure that the loaded cookie is valid. So someone actually within our Discord brought up the concern of being able to manipulate the user ID inside of the cookie and then take action as that user, right? Because inside of our code as it stands right now, if we look at our hooks.server, we could see that we have if event.locals.pb.authStore is valid, right? And all this is checking is to make sure that token isn't expired, but it's not actually verifying that that user is associated with that token, and therefore it shouldn't really be trusted, right? Well, if you have proper API rules set up in PocketBase like we do thus far, then this really isn't too much of a concern, right? It's not a big security vulnerability. But as soon as you add some type of external, and I believe the maintainer mentions this here, so this is not an issue if you're sending requests only to the PocketBase server, but it's a good idea to validate the loaded authStore state server side so you can safely trust the is valid checks. So if you want to show some private node / third-party generated content based on that user being authenticated, then you should certainly update this. So we're going to update this because I don't see any issues with doing so. And if we look here at the commits that he made, let's just check here. We can see that he's just adding a try and then setting if event.locals.pb.authStore is valid. If it is true, then they want to run this auth refresh method here on the user's collection, which will refresh that user, ensuring that everything is good to go. And then it will, and then if not, so if it throws an error here, then we'll catch the error and then we'll clear the authStore, which is the same thing as logging that user out, right? So let's go ahead and take care of that. So if we go into our hooks here, hooks.server.js, what we're going to do is we're going to take in the cookies as we did before, and we're going to set up a try, and then we'll say if event.locals.pb.authStore is valid, which we actually have underneath. I could have just copied this. Then what we want to do is we want to await event.locals.pb.collection users, and then run the auth refresh method here. And then, so if this is good to go, if it doesn't throw, we want to set event.locals.user equal to the serialized non-POJOs that we have down here. So then we'll also catch here. So we'll say catch. And this underscore is basically saying that, hey, we're not going to do anything with the error if we catch it. We just want to take action, log the user out. I don't really care what the error is, log them out. So we'll say event.locals.pb.authStore.clear. And then we'll also set event.locals.user equal to undefined. And then what we can do is we can just remove all of this here. And then I believe we should be good to go on that aspect. So we can go ahead and test this out. Let me make sure my application is running, and it is. And then we can go to our site here and I'll log in with one of my users. Okay, so we are in fact logged in. Everything appears to be working as expected. Cool, so let's go ahead and start off with our input / form validation. So one thing that we're definitely gonna need first is to install Zod. So we'll do npm install -d, we can do Zod. All right, so once we have that installed, now what we want to do is we actually want to define some schemas. And again, if you don't know what a schema is, go watch my other video on this. I kind of walk you through the basics of this so you have a solid foundation. Otherwise, this video will be 2 hours long. So we're going to define all of our schemas inside of lib, and we're going to create a new file called schemas.js. Now you could do this in any of the files inside of the page.servers. It doesn't really matter. I just like to have them here. It makes me feel good. So the first thing that we're going to be validating is actually our login user schema. Right? So the login user, if we recall, when we log out here, when we go to login with the user, we just take in an email and a password, right? We want to make sure that this is actually an email, okay? And the password, we don't have to check for any specific requirements other than maybe the fact that it's actually a string, but the email should be an email. And we already have HTML form validation here, but just to kind of show you that this could easily be manipulated, if we go here and we change the type to text, now I'm able to submit that here, right? So we want to be able to validate this regardless of what the HTML is doing, okay? So let's go ahead and define a schema. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import Z from Zod. And then I'm going to export const login user schema, right? And this is where we're going to define what we want the login data to look like. The data that comes from that form to our server, what do we expect it to look like, right? We're defining that structure here. So it's going to have an email, right? Which is going to be a z.string. it's going to have a required error. So if it's not passed at all, we're going to say email is required. And then we're going to set .email, and this message is going to be email must be a valid email. So required error will show if the property is missing altogether. And then email will show, this message here will show if they type in a string like we just did instead of an actually properly formatted email. Okay. And then we're going to set up a password, which is going to be a z.string. It's just going to have a required error. And we're just going to say password is required. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to define a utility function that's going to take in some form data and the schema that we want to validate that form data against. And it's going to return us back the form data values or object, I guess you could say, as well as the errors array. So all the errors that are generated as well as the data itself. And this will make sense here in just a second as to why we're doing this. But we're going to come into our utils.js and we're going to export const validate data. It's going to be asynchronous. It's going to take in form data, which is going to be a form data object, and then a schema, which is going to be one of the schemas that we just defined. We're going to set body equal to object.fromEntries, and we're going to take form data here. So it's going to turn the form data object into an actual JavaScript object. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open up a try catch block because schema.parse or parsing within Zod will throw an error, right? So we can say const data equals schema.parse body. So again, just to cover what we're doing here, we're taking in form data. So raw form data from the form. We're also taking in a schema, right? Like we just created right here. And then what we're doing is we're going to be able to validate the data that was passed in against the schema. Okay. And then if this is successful, we want to return form data like this is data. Errors is null. So null is intentionally blank. Undefined would be unintentionally blank, right? We are intentionally setting errors to blank here, okay? And then we want to catch the errors if it throws. We're going to console log the error first, just so we have an idea as to what it is in the console here. And then we're going to set errors. So const errors equals error.flatten. And what this flatten method does, and let me just pull up the Zod documentation here so you can see. I believe I may have covered this in my other video, but let me go to errors real quick. So if we go to the error handling section here of the Zod, we can see flattening errors. And what flattening the errors will do, will just make it a little bit more of an easier way to receive the errors back into our front end and then properly match up the errors with the respective input field. So we can see here that it's going to give us an object with field errors, and then it will have a field errors object with all of the properties that we passed into it, right? So if we're passing in this case, in this logging case, we're passing in an email and a password. So if there was errors on both of these, we would have email here, password here, with all the errors that it found, right? So that's where we're getting this from. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say return. So if there's an error, we want to return form data. We want to return the body back, right? Because data only exists if this was a successful parse, right? So if it was able to successfully parse this, then we have access to the parse data. If not, we want to return back what the user submitted so they can make their corrections and try again without clearing out that form, right? And then we also want to just return errors as errors, right? Okay, so now what we need to do is we actually want to go into our page.server.js for our login page here. And we're going to change the way that we're doing things, right? Because if we look at our utils, we're returning form data and errors, right? No matter what. What we can do is instead of saying const body equals object.fromEntries here, what we can do is we can say const form data errors equals await validate data, which we need to import from lib/utils. We're going to pass in await request.form data. And we're also going to pass in the login user schema, which we need to import from lib/schemas. Okay, so remember, errors is going to be null if there are no errors, right? So what we can do is we can immediately check to see if there's errors. So if errors is true, we're going to return invalid, which comes from SvelteKit, with a 400. We're going to say the data is the form data, and the errors are going to be the errors.field errors. And remember, this field errors comes from here, right? So right now, this is the errors object. we're getting the field errors out and we're returning those back to the client in the form of the form.errors, right? And we'll look at that here in just a second. Okay, so now we have to update our try catch block here. We're actually authenticating the user. So instead of being body.email and body.password, it's actually gonna be formdata.email and formdata.password. So remember, if it's invalid, if there's a validation issue, it's gonna return before it ever hits here, right? So that should take care of that for us here. Now what we can do is let's actually go into our login page here. And I can see that I'm not using these input components that we created in one of the previous episodes. So let's go ahead and start to use that here. So let's go into the top here and we'll import input from lib/components. And then I'm just going to take this div here. I'm going to turn it into an input. It's going to have a type of email, an ID of email, a label of email, and a value of form.data.email. And then we already are taking in form here at the top, as you can see, right? So otherwise we'll just do nothing. And I believe this is going to be the same thing, but just to be safe here, let's just add this. We may actually want to adjust this later on. Okay, so let's just check out our login form to make sure we didn't break something. As you can see, it got wider because we decided to make our components a bit bigger later on. And there's another good reason why you want to make components so everything stays consistent across your application. For this one, we'll do type is going to be password, right? And this is going to have an ID of password and a label of password. And then we'll also adjust the value, except this value is always going to be empty. So we'll just leave that alone, right? Because you don't want to return the password back to the client. If they mess up the email, they're going to retype the password in. Okay, so now we need to also adjust some of these max widths. So we'll make all of these large where it's medium. And then now our form looks pretty good here, right? So now if we attempt to submit something that is not an email, obviously right now there's no errors being rendered anywhere, right? So let's go into our input and actually set up the ability to render out some errors. So we'll be able to pass in an errors array, right? An array of errors, and then render out error messages for each one of those errors for any given input across our application. So the first thing we'll do is we'll come up here and say export let errors. And then underneath of the input itself, we're going to say if errors. So if errors, and then we'll say each errors as error. And we'll set up a label. So we'll say label is going to be 4 is going to be equal to the ID, just as the label above is. We'll have a class of label. And then within the label, we'll have a span tag, which is going to have a class of label text alt and text error. And then we'll just pass the error here. Okay, so for each error that's in that errors array that we're getting back from, remember, this is going to be an array of errors. So if there's only one, it's only going to render one error out, right? For every single one of those errors that we get back, if there is any errors at all, we're going to render out an error label underneath of the input that's just going to have the contents of that error message in it. It's going to be red. It's going to look good. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. So we actually need to go back to our login page here and we need to pass in errors, right? So errors is going to be equal to form.errors.email. Same thing here. We'll say errors equals form errors password. And remember, the form.errors.password is coming from, if we go to our utils, or I'm sorry, we go to our page.server.js here actually, and we look here, we're returning data and errors, right? So this errors is being passed through that form, which is here, and then we're able to access the errors on that. So we're saying, hey, if there's form errors.email, I want to pass them here, and then the input itself will take care of rendering those out, okay? So let's go ahead and give this a shot, and we'll just be sneaky here, and we'll adjust this input again. So we'll make it not an email. We'll actually change it to a type of text. That way it lets me submit it, and I will try to submit something here. So I'll just type in a bunch of letters. For the password, I'll just type something random in. If I hit login, you can see that the email must be a valid email. So we are in fact getting validation working there. Obviously the password validation is not going to happen because of the fact that we're not really validating anything other than the fact that it's a string. We'll take care of password validation on the registration form, which is what we are going to do next. Okay, so let's take a look at the register form and see what we're working with here. So we have a name, email, password, and a password confirm. So we obviously want to set some minimum requirements or minimum complexity levels for our passwords. We also want to make sure that these two match. We want to make sure that this is a proper string. And if you recall, we also want to make sure that the name doesn't have any special characters in it, doesn't have any numbers necessarily. So it should just be strings and spaces, right? That's all it should have. So let's go ahead and set up our schema for this. So if we come into VS Code here, we can close out of login for now, and we will go into our schemas file, and we'll define a register user schema. And the first property it's going to have is going to be a name. It's going to be a z.string. It's going to have a required error, and it's just going to say name is required. It's also going to have .regex, right? And this is a regular expression that we're using to check to make sure that the name can only contain letters and spaces. And then the message for this is we'll pretty much tell them that, right? So name can only contain letters and spaces. And again, this is the message that gets rendered to the client or in the error message on our form if they violate this constraint. We'll set a minimum length of 2, a maximum length of 64. And these values here are lining up with our database, right? So minimum 2 is what we set for the minimum, and then maximum is 64. So this is lining up with PocketBase to make sure that we're, checking to make sure that we're not submitting anything that's just going to get rejected by PocketBase when it gets there. And then we'll trim off any white space at the end of a name. Now for the email, we'll say z.string, right? We'll have a required error for this, of course. It's going to say email is required, and it's going to be email. Then that should be good for that. Now we're getting to the password. Now we're going to have a regular expression I'm actually going to copy over here. But what this is going to do, and you can look these up, there's tons of them out there that you could use depending on what you want for your application. I just found a happy medium for our app here. So it sets the password to a minimum of 8 characters, at least 1 letter, 1 number, and 1 special character. There's much more complex ones out there that you can use. I just chose this one as it's a little bit complex, but nothing too crazy. So it's going to be a string. It's obviously going to be required, right? It's going to have a regex, and I'm just going to copy this in here. So you can see this is it. That's why I want to type it in. And then we'll have a message here, and we'll pretty much say exactly that, right? And then we're going to set up a password confirm. It's going to be essentially the exact same thing. So we can just copy this here, cheat a little bit, confirm password is required, and then we can just leave the message here like this, and we'll change this to password confirm. Okay, now there's one last thing that we need to do this. We actually need to run a super refinement, which essentially Zod gives us the ability to, if I go back here to their website here and I look for super refine. So if we look at refine by itself first, we can see that we can provide custom validation logic via refinements. It essentially lets us define our own custom issues and do things that Zod doesn't come with out of the box, right? And that's what we're going to do to check to make sure these two passwords match up. So we can set up .superRefine here, and it's going to take in password confirm and password, right? And these are going to be the values from our Zod schema. And then it's also going to take in the context, right? The current Zod context. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if password confirm is not equal to password. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say ctx or context.add issue. So we're adding an issue here, our own custom issue. It's going to have a code of z.zod issue code. .custom. The message is going to say password and confirm password must match. And the path is going to be what field is this error for? In this case, it's going to be for the password. We're going to copy this one more time, and we're going to set this to the password confirm, right? So it's going to pop up for both of these fields. And that's all there is to it. Okay, so you can do whatever you'd like here. We'll get into more super refinements in a bit when it comes to the images and whatnot. So you'll get to see how that works in that sense as well. So we should be good to go here if we click save. And then we need to come into our register page.server.js here, and we need to make some adjustments. Okay. So if you noticed, we actually didn't add username to our schema, right? And that's because before we even generate a schema and put our application through that extra efforts or through those extra efforts, we want to make sure that the data is valid, right? So let's just take care of this first. The username will be generated by our own function here. So we know that it should be valid, right? No matter what. If not, we need to fix our function. So let's just go here and do const form data and errors equals await validate data. we'll pass in await request.formData, as well as the schema, which is going to be the register user schema here. Let me just fix these imports up. Okay, so we're on the same exact check. We'll say if errors, we're going to return invalid with a 400. We'll say data is form data and errors is errors.fieldErrors. Same exact thing. You're going to start to see a pattern here. And this validate data function really makes our lives so much easier by taking care of a lot of the logic, the try catch blocks, and then also making it easy for us to check to see if there's an error. Okay, so then on our username piece here, we're going to change this to formData.name, right? And then here, we're going to say .formData, and then here as well, formData. Okay, so now we should be able to go to our register page here, and we're not using those inputs here either. So let's just go ahead and create one starting with this one here. We'll say input. We'll have to import that in from lib/components. Make sure this is wrapped in brackets, and we just have to do input lib/components here because we're taking care of those exports over there. And then we'll have an ID, or the type, I guess, for this one will be email. The ID is going to be email. The value is going to be equal to, or I guess we'll do label first. Label will be equal to email, and then value will be equal to form data email. And then we actually need to take in form here, so export let form. And then we can just copy this a few more times for the name, password, and confirm password. So let's just go ahead and take all of these out here down to this piece. And then I'll rename this one to name. So it's gonna be a type of text, so I can just leave it blank. ID will be name, label will be name, and then this will be name as well. Here, this can remain an email. For these two, the types are gonna be password. ID is gonna be password, and then password confirm. Okay, so we also need to pass in errors, right? So errors is going to be equal to form.errors.name for this one. And then it'll be the same thing for the rest of these with their respective names. Okay, so we have these good to go now. I believe that should be all that we need at the moment to make this work. So let's go ahead and test this out. Actually, let's make our button max width large here. There we go. Everything looks a bit cleaner now. So let's go ahead and test this out. So if I just type in a single character for the name, we should get a bunch of errors back, right? It's going to tell me that the name must be at least 2 characters, the email must be a valid email, and then it also has the passwords regex expression matching here as well. So let's actually type in some valid information. So say Hunter, and then I'll say, this is one of my test emails I have set up, by the way. And then let's just type in a password that does not meet the requirements. When I hit register, you can see the errors for these 2 fields went away. The values actually remained, and we actually need to make sure that these values do not come back here, the password. So we actually need to go into our password fields, our inputs, and we need to take value away from there. Okay, so now if I try that again, that's what should happen. It should take the passwords away. And then if we type in a password that does meet the requirements, but doesn't match, we should get password and confirm password must match. Okay, so now let's actually make sure that these meet the requirements and they do in fact match, and then we'll click register. And then if we go into our PocketBase server here that's running on port 8090, we're now going to see that a new user was created with my new email here, and you can see that everything was good to go. It's waiting on me to confirm my email, which is fine, but we're just focused on the form validation piece, so that seemed to have worked. All right, so I think the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to update our add a project. So let me just log in with a valid user real quick. Then go to add a project. We can see that, okay, now it's going to get a bit trickier, right? Because we now have an image to work with. So let's figure out how we can actually take care of this with Zod and form actions, right? So if we go into our schemas here, we're going to define a new schema, and it's going to be called create project schema. Again, it's going to have a lot of the same properties. It's going to have a name, a tagline, a URL, and a description. So let me just knock these out really quick. Okay, so now we have the basics here. We have the name, tagline, URL, and description. And now we want to validate our thumbnail, right? So how we can do that is we can set up a thumbnail property here. It's going to be a z.instance of. And in this case, it's going to be a blob, right? Because when it comes back to the server, it's going to be a blob. We're also going to have optional here, meaning that it doesn't have to be passed. And then we'll say .superrefine. And actually, let me save this so it formats properly. I guess it won't just yet. We're going to take in a value and a context here. Same as it did before, except previously we just destructured the value. So values here, context here, up here, we actually just destructured that first argument and took out password and password confirm. But in this case, since we're just super refining this single field here, we can just do it like so. Okay, so then we can say if value, then we want to say if val.size, right? So right now we're going to check to see, is this image bigger than our maximum that we set in PocketBase? So if we come into PocketBase and we go to projects, settings, thumbnail, we can see the max file size in bytes is right here. So we can just copy that. If the size is greater than this, which is 5 megabytes, we're going to do context.addIssue. The code is going to be a z.zodIssueCode.custom. And the message is going to be thumbnail must be less than 5 megabytes. Then we can also check to see if, and we actually need to define some image types. So right now we're going to check to make sure that this is the proper file type, right? Because again, we can set the accept option on our file input. However, it can be manipulated. So we want to make sure that we're checking to make sure that the proper image types are here before we try to send them over to our server. So we can just define const image types here. There may be a better way to do this. This is just the way that I found to be the simplest. Okay, so now we have this image types array, right? Which is pretty much an array of all the types that we want to accept from this blob. We can say if not image types dot includes val.type, right? So the type of this blob, when you go to thumbnail.type, it should show image/png, image/jpeg, whatever. If this array here does not include this, right? So if this is basically not inside of this array, then we want to add an issue. So context.addIssue should be familiar by now. And we'll say unsupported file type. And we'll add these supported formats here for the users. Okay. And then also what we need to do is we actually need to pass in the user along with the create project schema here, right? So what we can do is we can actually add user. It's going to be z.string. Put a comma here, and required error, we'll just say user is required. Okay, so now let's go into our register page.server here. Well, I'm sorry, not register. The project's new page.server here. And we can see that we're doing some checks here. So we're checking to see if the thumbnail is 0. If so, we're going to delete the thumbnail so that we're not accidentally overwriting the thumbnail that we currently have if the user decides not to change it, right? So what we'll do is we'll just do something similar here. So we're going to say const body equals await request.form data, right? And then we're going to need to rename this thumbnail to, we can just say thumb, because we're going to have thumbnail in other locations have this function in a second here. So we'll say if the thumbnail.size is 0, then we want to delete that from body. So body.delete. And then we're going to say body.append user is locals.user.id. So now what we can do is we can say const form data and errors equals await validate data body. And then we'll pass in the create project schema. And we actually also need to import validate data from lib/utils. And then what we need to do is we actually need to strip thumbnail out of form data first before we check to see if there's any errors. And I'll kind of explain this in just a second. So if we type thumbnail here and then we do ... rest equals form data, we're just taking thumbnail out and then everything else is assigned to this rest variable here. And then what we can do is we can say if errors, say return invalid, just as we have done in the past. Then data in this case is going to be rest. Errors will be errors.field errors. And the reason we're doing this, right, is because we can't return the thumbnail back. It's not serializable, right? So we can't return that thumbnail back to the client in the form of data like this. So we actually want to take it out, return just rest. So just the other properties, right? Just the name, the tagline, description. But we do want to include all the errors. So we do want to make use of that thumbnail's error if there is one. And we'll show you how to handle that here in just a second. Okay, so right now we have an object that has all the properties that we need to create a project in PocketBase. However, PocketBase is going to be expecting that image to come across as multi-part form data, right? So what we actually need to do is we need to install a little helper lib here. And again, there may be a better way to do this. If there is, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll make sure to pin it if it will help the users make this a bit simpler. But we're just going to install object to form data. And then what we're going to do is at the top, we're going to import serialize from object to form data. And then what we'll do is we'll come down here into our try block. And then instead of just passing form data, we'll pass in serialize form data, just like that. Okay, so now let's check this out. So let's go into our application here and let me choose a file. So I have a bunch of files here and you can see that I have a few that are over the threshold, or I have one that's over the threshold. So we have this engineering one here. But first we actually need to update our page. So let's go back here and do that first. Thankfully, we're already using inputs. This is a text area, which we can just create essentially the same thing for. So let's just take the text area on that page and we'll copy all of this here. And we'll create a new component and we'll say text area dot svelte. And then we'll take in a lot of the same properties that are here. And then we'll just pass all of these to this like so. So we have text area, and I'm pretty much just copying a lot of the same things that we have in the input. You could probably actually just use this component or use a Svelte component for this. But again, I'm just trying to be as brief as I can in this coverage. So we actually need to get this class here. Pass that in. And then we have label, which will go here. And then for, we'll take in the ID. And then we'll also have the same errors down here. Okay, so that should be good to go now. So we should be able to replace that text area here with a text area. We have to obviously export it properly first. So let's go here, we'll import it. Then we'll be able to import that here just like so. The ID will be description. The label will be description. And then this is the create project. So the values for all of these will be equal to form.data.description. We need to take in form at the top. And then we'll do the same thing for all of these as well. Updating the names for each one. And then for the file input though, we can just easily do something here. We can say if type is equal to file, then we'll say something else. Otherwise we'll use this. And let me close this off here. So we'll just take in the file input styling here. Okay, so we're going to have the file input styling if it's equal to file. If not, we're going to have the regular input styling. So we should be able to do the same thing here now with just inputs. Make sure we set the type to file, and the value is actually just going to be empty, but we will start to have errors. So we'll say form.errors.thumbnail here, and we'll copy this errors up to the rest of these like so. Then we actually need to close this input here. Okay, there we go. So let's check this out. So everything looks the same to me so far. We should be good to go. So let's just give it a name. So we can say PocketBase. And then we choose a file. Let's just choose one that's too big, right? Let's just choose this engineering one here. So now if we click on create project, we're going to get an error. So let's see what happened here. Cannot access form data before initialization. So let's just check to see why that happened. And that's because if we see here, we're doing form data.get instead of body.get. So that's my bad. So make sure we change this to body here like so. And now let's try this again. Okay. And then I'm going to upload an image that's too big. I'm going to click on create project. We're going to see that same error message on all of these fields or input fields. And that's because when we copied over the errors, we forgot to change these. You probably already caught that and changed them. But if not, be sure to change these to the respective names. Okay, so now we're just getting the error message on the thumbnail. So the thumbnail must be less than 5 megabytes. Okay, so the validation is occurring for the thumbnail. And then if we do select one that is proper, let me just make this a better description. And then click on create project. We will see now that we have a new project created. The data was validated and we are good to go. And again, you can obviously go through and test all of these. So I just try to change the name right now. I'm obviously editing it. So I don't have validation set up for editing it yet. So let's go ahead and set that up now. So Zod has something that's really cool. So really the only thing that we don't need when editing this that we do need whenever we are creating this is the user. Okay, so if we go to Zod here and we look at pick.pick or .omit, I apologize. We can see that all Zod schema objects have a pick and omit methods that return a modified version. Consider this recipe schema. They define a recipe here. To keep only certain keys, use pick. So we can just take out the name, right? Or we can use omit to just take one of these out, right? To take out one of these properties. So that's what we're going to do for the update project schema. Now I have had issues with pick. I'm not really too sure why, but I have had issues with pick. And you'll see I don't actually use it in a place that I could here in the upcoming minutes. But I run into issues with this sometimes. So again, if it happens to you, it happens to me as well. So let's go into schemas and we'll come down here. We'll say export const update project schema. Let me close out of that terminal over there. We'll say create project schema dot omit and we'll say user is true. So we basically are saying omit the user. We want to keep everything else but the user, right? Okay, so now that we're omitting the user, we have everything in create project schema except for the user, right? So now we should be able to go into our, let's close the others. Let's go into our projects edit page.server. And then we'll come down here to actions for update project. We'll do the same thing. So we'll change this to body here and here as well. We'll change this to thumb. And then we'll come down here and we'll say const form data and errors, just like we've done in the past, equals await validate data, body, and the update project schema, which comes from lib/schemas. And we can say here, we can say validate data like so, and that should be good to go there. And then we also want to do the same thing with the thumbnail, right? So we're going to say const thumbnail rest equals form data. And that's again, because you don't want to return that back with any errors to the client side, right? So we're going to return invalid. It'll actually throw an error if you try to. So we have invalid imported, so we can say 400. And then we're going to have an object with data as rest and errors as errors.fieldErrors. Okay. And then we also need to serialize this form data here. So let's do serialize, which comes from object to form data. So we can say import serialize from object to form data at the top, like so. That way it'll serialize our image back up into multi-part form data so that PocketBase will properly receive it. And then I believe we should be good to go here. So let's just check out the page.svelte here for this. And we want to make sure that we set the value now. So instead of data.project.name as the first value, we actually want this to be the second value. So we want the first value for all of these to be the form, right? So it takes priority. So I'm just going to move all of these over. And we actually want to update this text area altogether. So for this one, instead of saying data.project.name, I'm going to say form.data.name and form.data.tagline. I need to also export let form here at the top. Make sure we get rid of those errors. And then I can just make this a text area. So we'll say text area. It's going to have an ID of description, a label of description or project description. The value is going to be form data description, or else it's going to be data.project.description. And then it's also expecting something else from me. Let me see what that is. Errors, I believe. So we'll say errors equals form errors dot description. And then I need to import text area here at the top. And then I need to make sure I have the proper errors on all of these as well, and actually update the names this time to name, and then tagline, URL, and then description. And then for this thumbnail, what we can do is we can leave this alone here. We can actually just leave this alone because of the fact that we are doing some extra things here with this. It's not going to properly fit with our component. So what we'll do is we will come down here though, and we'll probably just add the error labels. So we can just say, take this here, then come down to underneath of the input. And then instead of checking for if errors, we can say if form dot errors dot thumbnail, and then we can say each form errors thumbnail as error. And then this will be 4 is going to be data.project.thumbnail, or I'm sorry, data.project.id, or the 4 is actually going to be thumbnail. So we'll say 4 is equal to thumbnail. Then I think that should be good there. So now when we edit PocketBase, if I try to not have a name here, we'll see name is required. Okay. So we know these are working right. Now, what if I decide to delete this image here? We now no longer have an image. It did retain this though, right? So we need to fix that, because right now, if I delete that thumbnail, so let's just upload it again. Now all of the rest of my application is just messed up now. So backend in one file, and really I could probably just refresh this page here to get everything back, but still we shouldn't have to deal with that, right? So let's upload PocketBase back here, go to edit. When we click on delete, we can see that the entire form gets reset, right? So let's see how we can actually fix that. So if we come into our page.svelte here, and we're going to define loading is true, I'm sorry, loading is false, we're going to actually set up a use enhance handler function. So we'll do const submit update project. We'll set loading to true as the function kicks off. We'll take in results and update. And then we'll say switch result.type. We're checking the result types. Case of success, we want to do what? We want to await invalidate all if it was successful, which we actually need to import from app/navigation. And then we'll break. Case of error, what we'll do is we'll just break. And then for the defaults, we'll await update. And this comes from here, right? And what this is going to do is it's going to update the form data with the data from the form. And then what we'll set is loading equals false. Okay. And then now we need to come down here to use enhance, and we need to say submit update project like so. And then if we test this out, we should be able to add an image here, go back to edit project. We can now click on this delete button here. It deletes the thumbnail. We can then edit the tagline, for example, save changes. Now we're getting that automatic generated image that we had set up. And then we can also upload something that is too big. We can see that the error is not quite rendering out there. So, and it's because if we look here, I misspelled thumbnail again, thumbnail. I continue to do that. So now we have this here. We should actually see that thumbnail must be less than 5 megabytes. So let's upload the proper one again. And you can see that we are good to go here on editing our projects. So we have a couple more inputs still to validate. So if we go to settings now, we can see that we have name here, obviously the updating of the profile. We have the account for changing the email and the username. And then we obviously have the password as well. So let's go ahead and start with the updating of the account, email, and username. So let me close out of all of this here, except for schemas. We'll come down here and we'll say export const update email schema. It's a z.objects and it has an email. And then that's it for that one. We can also go ahead and define the username schema while we're here too, and kind of take care of both of those at the same time. So we can say export const update username schema. And what we want to do is for username, we actually want to run a regular expression again, to make sure that they're not passing anything crazy. We're just going to allow alphanumeric characters for our usernames. We'll set the minimum to 3 and the maximum to 24. Okay, and then we have a message here that will essentially just tell them what this is pretty much already doing. Username can only contain alphanumeric. We can say letters or numbers to make it more user-friendly here. Okay, so now we have a username schema and the email schema. So let's go ahead and update those files. And these are both in the my settings and then account settings here. So I chose to do them together. So we have the update email now. So we already know the drill here. We'll just say const form data and then errors. And then we'll import the schema. We'll go ahead and update or grab the update username schema as well. And we import validate data from our utils. We'll again check to see if there's errors and then return invalid if not. And then we need to update the request email change to formdata.email instead of data.email. Everything else should be good to go here. And then we can go move on to the username now. Again, it's going to be the exact same thing pretty much, just replacing a couple of the email fields with username. So we'll say form data and errors. And then down here, we're going to do get first list item username equals form data.username. This is where we check to see if the user exists. And then we also have to update this down here as well. We'll say form data.username down here. And then the rest of this can remain as is. We should be good, go there. And then we already have some things set up over here. So what we want to do is inside of our inputs, we'll just say errors, formed errors, email, and the value will remain at form data email here. We'll copy this down for username as well. We'll change this to username. And then I think we should be good here as well. So let's check this out. So let's go to change email first. We can also change the username here. So we can enter the new username. We can make this Iris1. Then that updates. Okay, so now we have the username and the email set up. We should be able to now go and set up the password the same way essentially that we set up the passwords before. So we're gonna do some copying and pasting over here. So let's go ahead and dive into that one. Let's go into our schemas and we'll just have an export const update. So we'll say update password schema. We'll come up here to our register schema. We'll take password and confirm password, as well as this super refinement here. And then we actually have old password as well. So I think is it password and let me just check the page really quick. So password confirm. We also have old password. So we can just make this a string that's going to be required. That way, that'll get caught if they don't type anything in there. But then we're also going to still run our same regular expressions here to make sure the password still meets those requirements and that those two passwords do in fact match before sending this to the server. Okay, so we can go into that page.server here under security. And then again, we'll do the same thing we've been doing for a while now. So we'll take in form data and errors. And then here, we're just going to return errors is going to be errors.fieldErrors. And we're actually not going to return anything for the data because of the fact that we don't want to return those passwords back to the user. We want them to retype them all in. So we're just going to return errors here. And then down here, instead of doing data, we'll do form data. And that should be good to go here. So let's test this out. What happened? Validate data is not defined. Let me import that. I apologize. Okay, so it appeared to work. So let's do a login really quick. Awesome. Now, if I try to change it to something that isn't as secure, so let's do. Okay, so it is not actually rendering the errors because we need to update that on the page. Again, I apologize for that. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So we can say errors equals form.errors.old password. We need to actually import or accept that prop, export that form, and then we'll do the same thing for these two here. Alrighty. And then now we can already see that the messages are actually rendering because they were there. We just weren't actually displaying them. So we can see that the password must be a minimum of 8 characters and contain at least one letter, one number, and one special character. So try this one more time. This one is going to be one that doesn't match. So password and password confirm must match. And now it logs me out and wants me to log back in with my new password. And we are good to go. Awesome. Okay, so for updating the profile, I believe that's our last form to validate here. Not really too sure how long this video has gotten to at this point. I wanted to be able to get to doing toasts and stuff, but that might have to make it to the next video just because of the length of this. But I think this is going to be good information for you all when building applications moving forward. So let's move into our schemas here. And first, let's look at our profiles. We have my profile. So all we're doing here is just the name and the avatar, right? And then avatar, what do we have set for the avatar? Let's look at our users, settings, avatar. We have 5 meg here as well. We actually aren't accepting image/webp. So let me just do that here. I'm not sure if we're doing that on the other one as well, but let me just check. We are, okay, cool. So now for avatar, let's create a schema. Again, we're essentially going to use the same thing as this here. And then we'll say export const update profile schema. And the name, actually, I wonder if we could just do, oh yeah, I forgot. So .pic for some reason has an issue with me most of the time. So I'm just going to copy name here. So name must be these, right? And then we also want the thumbnail, which will actually be an avatar. So we'll say, I don't really know why I made this an arrow function, so please forgive me. It's me z.object. And then we'll wrap that here. Then we'll paste in thumbnail, which we're going to rename to avatar. So I think that should be good to go. We'll rename this. We'll say avatar must be less than 5 meg. And that should be good to go as far as the schema goes. So now we can go into the page.server and again, do the same thing. So we'll just make this, we'll do this step first. And then if we don't have an avatar, it's optional, right? So we'll just say form data and errors. And we're passing body here because this is the same thing, right? It's already, we already accessed the form data. So now we're just going to pass body here instead of doing it again. And then we also need to import validate data. And then we need to actually serialize that data. So we're also going to import serialize from object to form data here. And then we'll check to see if there's errors. So data is actually going to be data or the form data without the avatar. So we'll say const avatar. And really we just have name, but I'll just do rest here in case you decide to add any additional fields to your profiles. And then errors will be errors.field errors. And then we'll come down here and we will say serialize this data here. And this data is actually going to be form data. And then everything else should be good to go from what I can see. All right, so let's go to edit my profile here under settings, profile. If I update this profile picture to something that's too big, I actually need to update the page real quick. So let's make sure we do that. So we have the input for the file here, which let's just add a label. So let's grab one of the labels that we took from the project edit page, right? And we'll just do this here, right? Because we have a custom input there. So we'll go back into our profile settings. And then underneath of the input, we'll say if form.errors.avatar. It's going to be for avatar. And then we need to take in form actually. So let's say export let form. And then for the first input here, which is, where is that? For the name, here it is. We'll say form.data.name. Otherwise, we're going to do data.user.name. Disabled will be loading. And then we'll also do errors equals form errors name. Okay, so if I just delete the name out and press update, I should be getting an error here. So let's see what's going on in my console. Data is not defined. So let's look here at the actual update profile. So it's again inside the avatar. I need to change this to body.delete avatar and body.get avatar. So now if I try to submit this, cannot destructure property of avatar of form data as it is undefined. And that is because I'm not awaiting the validate data method here. Sorry, it's getting pretty late over here. So apologize for me being a bit sloppy right now. But now we're getting name is required here as an error. So if I change this back, update. When I update it, you can see that it pretty much instantly updates. look at PocketBase to make sure. We can see that that is in fact updating just really quick. And then for images, if we try to upload an image that's too big, we see the avatar must be less than 5 meg. We refresh the page, the old avatar is still there and ready for us to use. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things more that I want to do here. So we're not actually checking on these pages. We don't actually have a load function set up to check to see if the user to throw a redirect to the login page, right? Because only authenticated users should be accessing these pages anyways. It should probably render out an error message, I believe, if they would try to access it, just because the data it's going to try to get when they access that page, it's going to eventually throw from PocketBase. But we can add these checks here to be safe. I had somebody actually mention that in a comment below. I believe I've maybe forgotten a few different small things here and there. But as far as the projects themselves, the project pages, these are meant to be like public pages, right? So right now this project says not found for some reason. Not too sure why. Let's see here. Oh, and that's because let's look here at our my project item here. That's the other thing I was going to fix is right here. We have a bad link. So it should be /projects/project ID. When I change this now, we can see that now we get the actual image we're looking for. So I can click on this, but these are meant to be public pages. Again, for this application, this could be public content that you're sharing. It could be whatever, right? You could also make it private by just preventing users from accessing this unless they're the owner. So however you want to do this, again, I'm just trying to cover as much as I can as far as CRUD goes, as far as validating data, protecting your routes, and things of that nature. So I think that's going to conclude this video. Hopefully in the next one, we can move on to doing some more fun things like adding some toast here and there. I'm trying to think about what else we are going to do prior to deployment, but deployment is definitely something that's coming up as well. So I look forward to those episodes and I will see you all in the next one.